Hello, good afternoon. Thank you. If I could just have your attention, please. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name's Peter Welling. I'm the CEO of Serco Asia Pacific. I'd like to first of all start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Welcome, of course, to everyone joining us in the room and also to the people joining us online. We're really proud to be a sponsor here today, and I want to thank Megan and CEDA for the opportunity to do that and for their work in facilitating the event. I think there is a bit of joy back in everyone just to be in and around the room and to be out and about, and especially without masks on. It's been fantastic. We're all looking forward. Congratulations, everyone. Thank you, Premier. We're all looking forward to hearing from the Premier, engaging in what no doubt will be an interesting discussion. I'll also invite you, as Megan did, to follow CEDA on Twitter at CEDA_news and to join us today in the conversation using hashtag State of New South Wales. We're also encouraging you to join in the conversation on the Pigeonhole app or directly log in via live stream on ceda.pigeonhole.at. and also use the password State of New South Wales. And don't forget to enter those questions. I know we're ready to go on those on the table. We had a couple come in already. And we're also going to take a little bit of time at the end to reflect on those feedbacks. So here we go. I, like Megan's story, became, and like the Premier, CEO halfway through COVID. So a very unusual situation that I spent in my home office next door to my 13-year-old son, Charlie, who was having a pretty bad attempt at trumpet lessons. So I've asked the Premier, can we ban trumpet lessons at home, please, very much. Make that effective immediately. That'll be awesome. But on a serious note, I hope you'll all agree with me that we are now, hopefully, beyond the worst of the pandemic and towards more precedented times. It really does, for me, feel like a time for hope and renewal built on the shoulders of our frontline heroes, a time for optimism and a time now for us after the year we all had. As a leader of 16,000 Australians, I'm continually amazed by the everyday heroes that kept going about their work through COVID and doing amazing work for us. I know that I cannot do that work. I cannot do the work of Serco's frontline doctors, nurses, care assistants, cleaners or maintenance staff, or our correctional officers, but I get the privilege of doing a job like this where I can support them, and this is my purpose and that is my inspiration. In that context, I'm looking at the achievements in the last year and particularly how we approached them. The members, in my team, like Marta, who's part of the incredible Clarence Correctional Centre up near Grafton. Marta's passionate about helping people, providing opportunities for successful rehabilitation, came up with a great program halfway through COVID to look after our anxious inmates, and particularly found innovative ways to create music programs. And 2 or 3 of those were launched, and they've developed those, and they were launched and supported by Corrective Services New South Wales. So thank you to the people in the room that gave us the trust and confidence to do that work. I'm really proud of our COVID-19 teams that also help respond to the COVID-19 crisis, mobilising 24 hours a day service to help provide biohazard cleaning for the schools here in New South Wales. And when you look at what they had to do, put on to go to work, not where we thought COVID was, but where we knew it was, I want to thank them and recognise them for their courage. I'm really proud of our teams who cared for the most vulnerable people in our community, particularly the elderly and the young. And as a business leader, like many people in the room, I think we have to become more flexible and adaptable as we think about how we respond to these crises moving forward. And I'm pleased to see in the New South Wales Government that they did move fast, particularly under the Premier's direction. In this context, Serco has also worked very well with New South Wales. We were really pleased to help out with the New South Wales Health Surge workforce, particularly across 17 hospitals, and a healthcare workforce that enabled frontline nurses and doctors to get about their work, so we provided other support services behind them. We really appreciate the opportunity to do that, and also the work, again, in education, the maintenance work that continued on and the work that we did to keep those schools open. And as we were talking about here today, it's great to see kids getting back to what they need to be doing. So as we do get back to normal life, we also look forward to the work we do supporting venues in New South Wales. I think we need to start getting out and enjoying a few of those things again, puts back a bit of energy into our approach to life. So we really enjoy and thank people for being part of that. There are many opportunities to bring ideas, and we're hoping to hear some of those today as we work collaboratively towards the future. It is really clear to me as a business leader we have responsibility to drive the recovery alongside government as we enter this period. For Serco, it's been a privilege doing that work, particularly with the New South Wales Government over these challenging years. We have seen strong leadership and the dedication of the public service teams to make things happen. Now, it's with that context that I now invite Premier Perrottet to come up and address us on the state of the state. Thank you, Premier.
Well, thank you, Peter. And interesting story you just raised about your son and his trumpet. I've had this kid 3 doors down start playing the trumpet. I hope that's not your house. Megan, thanks. I want to reiterate your views. It's great to be back with a packed room, no face masks. Second time's a charm. Hopefully this one works out. But it's great to be here with everyone. And I think, as I said, the fact that we're all here today, in my view, shows that we're moving forward with our plan here in our state to get life back to normal. And today's, we see not just with face masks, but there's a whole range of restrictions that we are winding back. Now, when we announced these changes, some of which have come in today, last week, probably most people in this room, and I think the vast majority of people across our state were incredibly happy and supportive, but not everyone. And what's really interesting is on the same day that we announced our changes, Victoria made changes which were almost identical. But the response from the media and the critics in the two states were actually very different. In New South Wales, the criticism was too fast, too soon. In Victoria, they said the rollout was too slow and didn't go fast enough. Same policies, same restrictions, completely opposite reactions. And amid all the noise, through all the different opinions, what we've actually seen is that the Omicron impact has been the same up and down the eastern seaboard. Even with minor differences in our approach last year, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland have ended up in essentially the same place. And the common factor that has helped has been the vaccination rates. Our vaccination rates right across the country have saved thousands of lives compared to other nations around the world. Together, as a country, in the main, we have moved away from the lockdown mentality. And now we're all faced with the same job, every state, of securing a strong recovery. In New South Wales, our goal is to emerge from the pandemic stronger than when we entered it. And we can get there through recovery, readiness, and resurgence. My message today is that the strong foundations our government has laid over 11 years and our strong response to the pandemic over the past 2 has set New South Wales up for a resurgent 2022 and beyond. So where are we now? Well, you'll all be familiar over many of these lunches over 2 years, the pandemic's economic and fiscal impact. Alpha caused a nationwide shutdown, and in New South Wales, it cost us around 270,000 jobs. Delta required a more localised lockdown, and that cost around 240,000 people across our state losing work. We faced our first recession in almost 30 years. And together with the Commonwealth, our government worked to cushion the impact through programs like JobSaver and JobKeeper. We also stood up here a world-leading health response. And because of these efforts, we bounced back each time incredibly quickly. By December last year, unemployment in New South Wales fell to its second lowest rate in recorded history. More people were employed in New South Wales than before COVID arrived. And economic growth has rapidly returned each and every time we've moved out of restrictions. Then, over summer, came Omicron. Here, across our country and around the world, it spread like lightning, crashing Christmas, causing labour shortages and disrupting businesses. Here, business confidence dipped after reaching record highs over the course of the year. Credit card data suggests that spending also dipped well below expectations. In short, Omicron stalled our recovery. But it also shows, importantly, how our response is evolving. Job numbers fell in January by only around 1/10 of the losses in the previous outbreaks. And despite Omicron, there are still more people working in New South Wales today than before the pandemic. Many businesses and workers were affected, but many more were able to keep going. There was no citywide or statewide closure. Spending, we see, is already bouncing back. And the broad consensus is that the economic impact of Omicron is likely to be very short-term and temporary. All of this shows our state is more resilient, and that should give us confidence as we move through 2022. And I want one point very clearly. This summer, we made an important and inevitable transition in the way that we manage COVID-19. What we have achieved as a state and as a country over this summer has been a transition not just in our measures, but most importantly, in our mindset. It hasn't been easy, but despite what people say, it's actually been a phenomenal success. The key health indicators all peaked well below anything that the modelling predicted. We got kids back to school on day one. We rolled out millions of rapid antigen tests to families across our state. We put together another business support package to help our businesses get through. We've wound back restrictions. We've reopened our international borders. We've ended hotel quarantine for vaccinated travellers. University students are back on campus on day one. If they could get a train, they would have been back on day one. Anyway, they're back now. And international students was something we drove here in New South Wales, importantly, are back on campus and coming into the country as well. And this year, we may see the first increase in the official cash rate since November 2010. This is a picture of a state ready to rebound and ready to launch our next phase of growth as an economy and as a community. Now, we're in this position for one reason. Our pre-pandemic foundations were incredibly strong. Strong economy, strong finances, strong health system. Over the past 2 years, our government has deployed $46 billion in health, economic, and our social response to COVID-19. You can't do that without strong foundations. We started with the finances. When we came to office back in 2011, New South Wales was headed into deficit territory, even though at the same time, infrastructure investment across our state had flatlined. Public sector wages and other costs were blowing out. Our job at that time was to secure the finances, but importantly, kickstart infrastructure delivery too. So we implemented the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We found smarter ways to fund schools, hospitals, road and rail that our people need and deserve. And we boosted economic activity by cutting taxes, reducing red tape, and increasing support for working families. Now, we did all of these things in what you might call the good times. When economic growth was steady, when revenue was strong, we ensured we didn't waste the opportunity. We delivered record surpluses and record low net debt. And we invested to rebuild New South Wales like no other government in living memory. Our infrastructure pipeline has been a driver of economic growth in this state for many years. It has supported hundreds of thousands of jobs. I've visited, as Treasurer and now as Premier, many work sites across all our projects around the state, and the amount of young workers I meet who tell of the stories as they've moved from one state infrastructure project to the next, to the next, and to the next. A big part, as you know, of our infrastructure program has been in health. For 11 years, we have built up capacity to a point where it is by far the leading health system in the nation. And this is no exaggeration. Since 2011, we have delivered more than 170 health projects across our state. And currently, there are 110 more underway right across New South Wales. Now, in health, you can always do more and you can always do better. But to have a health system that can withstand the pressure of a once-in-a-century pandemic is no small achievement. We have seen what the alternative looks like in nations around the world that don't invest. Tent hospitals, patients banked up in corridors, crisis and chaos. Now, some experts predicted that our system would buckle. Other states, even during Omicron, have had to use hotels as hospitals or have been forced to seal their borders closed to buy time to increase capacity in their health system. That hasn't occurred in our state. Our health workers may be exhausted, and they have done an incredible job. But our health infrastructure has stood up to the test. We've administered millions of tests, traced and treated thousands of patients. We've stood up over 40 vaccination centres right across our state, manned by our nurses, and rolled out millions of vaccines. And we've done that whilst remaining the most open state in the country. Now, you can't build a health system like that with a click of a button. It takes time and investment over many, many years. This pandemic has been devastating for many people. We can't lose sight of that. But in the measures that matter, I believe the history will show that both the health and economic outcomes in the face of a global health catastrophe were exceptional here in Australia and exceptional here in New South Wales. And that is a testament to the economic, fiscal, and health foundations we built during the good times prior to 2020. But now, here in New South Wales and around the country, we must move towards recovery. And we do so from a position of incredible strength. It will be kick-started by over $3 billion in stimulus, ready to be injected in the New South Wales economy, and importantly, targeted for impact to help those businesses and those industries who have been doing it tough. There are still over 15 million Dine and Discover vouchers ready to be redeemed to support hospitality and entertainment businesses to the tune of $385 million over the coming months. $250 million in Stay in New South Wales vouchers to support tourism and accommodation. And a $250 Parents Pandemic voucher to say thanks to people like Megan and everyone in this room for your perseverance in homeschooling over 2 years, which I know as a father of 6 has been incredibly tough. I did want that payment to be per child, but didn't get that over the line. Actually, it was the opposite. Treasury wanted that per child, but I thought that wouldn't be a good look for me. These programs will give households and businesses confidence to rebound. And they complement more than 70 rebates and savings our government offers to help ease the cost of living. But they are also designed, importantly, to get great social outcomes as well. Teaching preschoolers to swim saves lives. Making creative and sporting activities accessible to kids opens new worlds of opportunity. Alongside our stimulus, many cautious households and businesses we've seen over this time have built up savings. The national household savings rate reached 20% in the September quarter last year. That's up 3 times the pre-pandemic rate. Aggregate business cash holdings have risen by 29%, even faster than households. So as confidence returns, these cash buffers provide another source of important activity. Then there is our $110 billion infrastructure pipeline rolling out over the next 4 years. It will support more than 300,000 jobs and create work for local businesses. Our project pipeline is the backbone of prosperity for the New South Wales of tomorrow. Right now, many other states and nations are looking to build their way to recovery. The major project sector, we know, is experiencing significant constraints. But in New South Wales, we have the advantage. You can't just turn on a $110 billion infrastructure pipeline overnight. Just looking at the projects valued at $50 million or more, New South Wales has nearly 90 underway. More than half are already in the construction procurement phase. And while other states are only getting started, we have a wealth of delivery experience to draw on. We have worked with industry to make procurement faster and cheaper. And we publish our up-to-date project pipeline online so that industry can plan ahead. Last year, at the height of the Delta outbreak, construction was paused. And sitting in those meetings, when that difficult decision was made, and the subsequent meetings as a former treasurer we had, and the engagement we had with industry, I think Simon Draper's here today, it was very clear to me, and I really understood how important our strong relationship with that sector is. That strong spirit, there's no doubt in my mind, that strong spirit of collaboration got us back on track quickly and smoothly. And while no one liked the pause, the sector was very gracious in acknowledging how well we worked to get moving again. Capacity constraints, as we know, will continue to ensure we face challenges on costs with projects and timing. Infrastructure Australia forecasts a skills shortage of more than 100,000 people in construction next year. But these challenges aren't unique to New South Wales. They apply to every state. But our early planning here means that New South Wales will be better placed to respond than almost anywhere in the world. And our new minister, who's here today, the Minister for Infrastructure, Rob Stokes, is driving that response. Our solution is to maintain those mega infrastructure projects, but at the same time pivot to those smaller projects where there is capacity in the market and these less complex projects where planning and design are simpler. But importantly, these projects, these small to middle-sized projects, can dramatically improve our quality of life. This week, I was out with Stuart Ayres, who's here today as well, to announce the first round of funding for our West Invest program, a program that was initiated following our WestConnex transaction and the creation of $5 billion in headroom, which is part of that asset recycling response we've been able to set aside for infrastructure projects across Western Sydney. And we announced this week that $400 million of that $5 billion will go to local councils in those areas that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. A further $1.6 billion will be allocated through a competitive grants process. This funding will deliver the parks and pools, revitalised high streets, sporting and cultural facilities. This is the stuff that binds communities together and makes neighbourhoods great places to live. Once again, that's the social outcome. But in the meantime, it's about driving economic and jobs growth in a way that supports those important social outcomes. So with strong foundations, stimulus ready to go, and a powerful infrastructure pipeline, we can be confident that New South Wales will see a strong recovery through 2022. Now, of course, as we've seen 3 times before, the pandemic isn't over. So confidence means being ready for any curveballs that come our way. New variants may come. Winter could also provide certain challenges. On the economic front, as I've said, labour shortages will become an issue. They already are. The threat of industrial action in our state could be a handbrake on recovery. And emerging international unrest could pose further domestic challenges in our state. We are all working to overcome and deal with these headwinds. The new Health Secretary, Susan Pearce, has been a dynamic force here in our state during our COVID health response, and her team is ready for those future COVID developments. Our Restore and Rebuild Committee brings together representatives across government to ensure all services are prepared for potential future waves. And they are specifically preparing to plan for winter, and those plans will be in place by March. We are building a substantial supply of rapid tests to meet any surge demand that's required, and we've refined rules around testing and isolation so they are appropriate for the risk at any given time. Hospital surge capacity remains in place, and we have reliable supply chains to rapidly scale up stock of PPE and other equipment if required. More importantly, we've boosted our workforce capacity with almost 3,000 new graduate nurses and midwives and more than 1,000 medical interns. Now, we're all hoping that Omicron represents the end of the epidemic phase of the virus. But we need to remain and will remain adaptable and ready for whatever comes our way, applying lessons learned at every step of the way over the past 2 years. Now, one promising development is that the states are more united today than at any stage of the pandemic. As Treasurer, I found that getting on the same page as other states always delivered better outcomes, and I've taken the same approach as Premier. And now we're seeing the benefits with states working together to move forward against the virus. Prudent planning for fiscal repair is also essential. Strong foundations and low interest rates have meant that we could deliver the support that our people needed at a reasonable cost. But there is a cost. And the cost of the last 2 years, it says $46 billion. And the people of New South Wales will be best served when the financial foundations in our state have been restored, and once again, we are insulated from future shocks that could come our way. And this is why the issue of public sector wages that's ongoing at the moment in our state must be handled in a mature way, not with the sledgehammer of industrial chaos. That applies especially in a pandemic, as working families slog their way back to recovery. Those families are at the heart of our economic rebound, because economic success must be about people getting ahead, not just statistics and figures. The word economy comes from the Greek, to manage a household. And for our government, family budgets will always be as important as state budgets, because Australia is strongest when Middle Australia is thriving, and we will support them every step of the way. The task of fiscal repair is no mean feat. And when you look at our track record in New South Wales, it's clear that not all governments are suited to the task. We've done it here before, and we will do it again. The pathway back, though, is not austerity, but growth. And that is why our government is looking beyond recovery to set up a period of resurgence. Last year, I outlined a number of policy priorities for my team. Each of those priorities will play a crucial part in securing the next phase of growth in our state. Increasing home ownership means financial security and social stability for more people, and therefore a foundation is a foundation of sustained prosperity. Our 6 cities vision for Bradfield, Parramatta, Sydney, Wollongong, Newcastle and the Central Coast will create greater productive opportunities for the region as a whole, and importantly for each of those individual cities. Reforming education and lifelong learning means focusing on outcomes in education that give the next generation a better chance at success. But it also means connecting skills with jobs in sectors where demand is already high or new capacity is growing. Increasing our manufacturing capability is another priority that will strengthen our sovereign capacity, create pathways for a new generation of highly skilled jobs, and open up new export markets. And continuing to modernise public services by designing them around people, not around government, will remove barriers to economic participation, such as rethinking school hours and better integrating school and childcare systems. Success for our government is measured by delivery and outcomes. I've tasked my cabinet ministers with tangible priorities to be delivered in the next 12 months, delivering and demonstrating concrete progress to achieving this vision. We will help people get into the housing market faster. We cannot have people, particularly young people, making the sacrifices to save for a deposit whilst at the same time actually going backwards. We'll continue to give boosts to family budgets and across the state in reducing the cost of living. I want New South Wales to have the lowest fees, fines, fares and taxes in the country. We want to create a local manufacturing renaissance in our state, closely aligned with our record infrastructure pipeline. Drive the development of e-health and associated health technologies alongside the country's best in-person support to ensure people have access to healthcare wherever they are, whenever they need it. We're going to transform our 3 cities vision to a vibrant 6 cities vision that will completely transform our state for generations to come. Reform education in this state to drive better teaching performance, better educational outcomes for our children, and increase flexibility built around families. And improve our quality of life for every regional community, giving them access to the best health, education, and infrastructure. We want people in the bush to love their town and the people moving there to not think twice. This is a policy platform brimming with opportunity for our state. A platform for resurgent New South Wales in 2022, but well beyond. As we have very clearly demonstrated over the last decade, we are a government that doesn't just think big, but delivers. Because ultimately, delivery matters. This is what the future of our state hinges on. Down the road is the Rozelle Interchange, one of the most complex pieces of engineering and construction in our state's history. This is a piece of road network that will take millions of cars off surface roads in the inner west over the coming decades. It will seamlessly connect east and west, north and south. And after decades of no one even daring to imagine such a connection, we are building it. If you head out to Bradfield, you can see it too. Empty paddocks, which are being transformed into a thriving centre of industry, research, education and transport. Delivery in real time, building our future state. In New South Wales, projects on this scale have become commonplace. But it would be a mistake to forget the political pain it has taken to get them built. Our government understands that for New South Wales to reach its full potential, there is heavy lifting that needs to be done. And never has that been more important and more true than right now as we emerge from the pandemic. The next few years will be pivotal in our state's history. Our strong foundations have put us in good stead. Our recovery is on track. We are ready for future challenges that come our way, and we must launch our post-pandemic resurgence. This is a job for a government that gets things done, and together, working with you, I'm determined that we will get it done. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. My name's Anthony Miller. I'm the Chief Executive of Westpac Institutional Bank, and Premier, thank you very much for that fantastic State of the State address. We are now entering in a bit of an opportunity for you to contribute to the session. You'll see that there's an opportunity to ask questions online. I'll try to balance it between the audience here. If you do want to ask a question, there's people passing microphones around. If you do have a question, please stand, state your name and the organisation you're coming from. Before we start, I might just open up with one question, taking further something you raised in your speech, Premier, and in particular what you also raised before we had lunch, which was this fantastic collaboration and partnership and coordination that you've delivered or developed with other states over the last 6, 12, 18 months. And I suppose the question for me is that sustainable? Because it certainly is so incredibly beneficial to have an alignment between state entities as we tackle what needs to be tackled as a nation. So interested in your thoughts in terms of how embedded is that opportunity going forward?
Well, I think it's incredibly important, Anthony, and as I said, I certainly enjoyed that relationship with treasurers when I was formerly in that role for 5 years. And I've always thought working with Labor treasurers, if you can get common agreement, that ensures better outcomes for all of our constituents. And being as Premier, I think one of the things probably frustrates the Prime Minister a lot is that what we've seen during the pandemic is the actual power of the states, that they can go and do what they want when they want, and the Prime Minister's got to kind of keep everybody together and bring where possible, bring a common outcome. But if we can strive to do that ourselves. So it's very clear to me early on when I became Premier, particularly when Omicron started, was that the relationship with Dan Andrews, for me, was going to be a particularly important one. I get criticised for being the open up guy. He gets criticised for being the lock it down guy. So if we could somehow work together and have similar settings in place, the ability for the media to criticise and instill fear in the community based on the approaches we were taking, we would take that off the table. So it was a strategic plan for both of us to mirror our settings where possible. And that has proven to be incredibly successful, because I think when you've got, particularly in the media, on any decision the government makes, it was the most ironic one I thought was, we ended up bringing QR codes back when we weren't even tracking and tracing. There was no science behind it at all. It had zero utility, but there was a massive campaign, and when those massive campaigns get run, what it does, it depletes confidence. And that kind of reporting, as we've seen over this period of time, has depleted confidence in our people. So we actually brought it back for one reason only, to instill confidence so that people would go out with using QR codes. But where Dan and I reached that agreement was, if we could come out on the same day with the same settings, whilst he would get attacked for not going far enough, and I'd get attacked for going way too far, we could work with each other to say, well, go look at Victoria, and he could say, go look at what Dom's doing in New South Wales. And it worked perfectly. I think that relationship, particularly with schools going back, where we reached agreement on schools. I mean, when we announced schools going back, the media would rush to find the scariest epidemiologist who was out there saying every child across New South Wales would die. And that was a problem, because we had to instill confidence. So what did we do together? We agreed that we'd go and get all these rapid antigen tests, which was a massive feat. I mean, we procured millions of these tests and had the plan together where we distributed them before school started to 3,000 schools across our state and 5,000 childcare and early childhood education centres. And by doing that together and having that plan, and here's another interesting thing about the pandemic, health completely disagreed with this approach, by the way. They didn't see the point of having surveillance testing, but education wanted it, because we needed to, once again, instill confidence in our teachers and instill confidence in our parents that children would be safe at school. And New South Wales and Victoria, once again, a Liberal state and a Labor state, having exactly the same policy in the main, really built that confidence in. So when those reports came in, those concerns came in to parents, that there was that sense that, well, if it's good enough for New South Wales and it's good enough for Victoria, I have greater confidence. I have greater confidence in the approach. And what have we seen since then? I think one of the most important successes over this period of time, because we both agreed, Dan and I, that it wasn't just about educational outcomes for our kids. Getting kids back in the classroom on day one brought back normalcy to life here in our state, well, here in New South Wales and in Victoria, as we move through this phase of the pandemic. And so I think that approach of collaboration, sharing of information, testing of ideas has been incredibly important, and I want to continue to foster that as we move through the next stages and beyond.
Thank you. It's a very enthusiastic question waiting in the audience.
I'm Martin Blake, and I was the former chairman of KPMG in New South Wales, and now I'm the chairman of iHelm, which we set up to focus on loneliness and mental health. I'd just like to say congratulations, Premier, on your leadership, not just as Premier, but also as Treasurer, for the work that you've done in helping navigate the way through the pandemic, because it has been a terribly difficult time for everyone. But I think the government has done an outstanding job, so congratulations. In 2013, only 27% of Australia's two-way trade was covered by free trade agreements. With the signing of the Australia-UK trade agreement on the first day of the Adelaide Test, which is the most liberating trade agreement that Australia signed since Captain Cook arrived into Botany Bay, it's a big deal. I understand now that approximately 75% of Australia's two-way trade is now covered by free trade agreements, and that represents essentially access for Australian businesses to preferential access to almost 3 billion customers. So my question is, what is the New South Wales government doing to put in place and leverage these free trade agreements? I was delighted to see last year that under the leadership of Stuart Ayres and Amy Brown that we've set up 6 international offices. So I think it would be interesting to share your thoughts with that, particularly in the non-traditional sectors outside of minerals and also agriculture. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Martin. Great question. And you're right in terms of the work that Minister Ayres has done with Amy Brown and Investment New South Wales, because my experience as previously as Treasurer is that we had really taken for granted our relationships with overseas countries, and the fact that in terms of investment into Australia, that when people think of Australia, they think of Sydney, they think of New South Wales. But what we'd seen from other states around the country is that they had a much more aggressive approach on 2 things. One, in driving investment opportunities in their offices overseas into their respective states. But in addition to that, providing more coordinated support for their local businesses in accessing those overseas markets. So through the work that Stuart's doing with Global New South Wales and setting up those offices right across the country, not only are we getting the right personnel and engagement at that level, we're providing greater coordination between those offices. Once again, the sharing of information and understanding to develop and appreciate where are those investment opportunities that are going forward. And with we call Stuart Ayres the Minister for Everything, because every time at a press conference with him, I can't remember what he's actually there for. He's got like 12 titles. But as a senior minister in the government, the elevation of this role to such substance, I think, clearly demonstrates the importance we place on this, rather than being at the back. And we've just recently brought back, you talk about the free trade agreement, the Agent General, which Stephen Cartwright, the former head of Business New South Wales, has started over in London, I think just last month. My view to your question will be that these structures in place will identify those opportunities for investment and those opportunities for further free trade agreements, or other agreements that may not be as strong, but may be as just important. And this is something that we have laid the foundation for. We set this up before the pandemic. Those foundations and structures are now in place, and I've complete confidence that Stuart will take it to the next level, ensure that our businesses have the outcome of reaching those markets, getting the experience in terms of and the skill sets they need to engage in a meaningful way, and ultimately as well to drive further investment into our state.
I might just go to a question online, well supported by a number of votes, but this is the question, Premier. A huge issue for New South Wales is scarcity of staff across all sectors. Are you confident that the federal government understands this from the New South Wales perspective? And what's the focus and what's the attention being attached to the solutions that need to be brought to bear on this?
Well, I've got myself in trouble going after the Commonwealth Government at points in time, and I've promised the Prime Minister that I will deal with him via way of text message and communication that way than through public forum going forward. So I'll be careful in my response. But I can say there is substantial engagement as there has been over 2 years in relation to staff shortages and labour shortages. We had issues with labour shortages before the pandemic began, and they've only been heightened and highlighted during this period. I spoke earlier in the speech about the shortfall, hundreds of thousands of people in the shortfall across the country when it comes to staff in infrastructure projects. We're also seeing this in less skilled staff, but in hospitality work. We are, the unemployment rate we can say is low, and that's important. But there's also contributing factors. We need labour into this country, and the move to get the number one thing we could have done was get the border open, and we certainly drove that in our state. And with Stuart, when we removed the requirement for hotel quarantine, which then led Dan to do the same thing, and then the international borders were the date was set shortly after that. But I believe they're engaged enough about it. In my former role and discussions with the Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, they see this and they appreciate it as an issue. Not only is it a problem for businesses in certain sectors, it's also a substantive problem for government's infrastructure agenda as well. But as Rob Stokes knows all too well, we were going through this in a committee meeting just last week, the challenge we have on the infrastructure staff shortages is that we're seeing infrastructure investment right around the world at the moment. A significant increase as many countries are using infrastructure investment to help stimulate their economy and drive growth out of the pandemic. So what we're doing here, whilst there was a great foundation laid coming into the pandemic, is now getting picked up around the world. So the two issues are getting skilled labour in, and I believe the Feds are working on that. The borders opening, I think, is the key first step. The second step is in relation to ongoing skills and training, and we need to make sure we match where those future jobs are with the requisite skills training going forward. And this is something that all good governments are looking at around the country, and that's the constant retraining and resetting of skills and tailoring that around people in the jobs that they're in so they can match that skill set and that training with where that future work will be.
Just invite any questions from the audience. While we're waiting, I'll move to a very popular question online. How will New South Wales ensure that the use of clean energy technology will be affordable and equitable?
Well, I mean, we are investing a substantial amount in this space through the work that the former Environment Minister, but the current Energy Minister, Matt Keane, in terms of our renewable energy zones in regional New South Wales. We have led the way, and we get into these climate debates, but ultimately this is an economic play. And as we transition into a renewable future, is exactly where the private sector is going. We need to, from a state's perspective, maintain baseload support, but at the same time be ahead of the curve, make the investments that will set us up for success. And if the state invests, then private sector investment comes off the back of it. So the work that, and one of the reasons Matt Keane, who was previously, as I said, Environment and Energy, kept the energy portfolio as he became Treasurer, is because we see energy not just as an environmental play, we see it as an economic play too. It's fundamental and instrumental in our economic success going forward. So I think as a state, we have led the way in terms of renewable energy investment, and you'll continue to see that going forward.
Just another question online, which I suppose is very topical at the moment. With the unfolding events in the Ukraine, how do you think that will affect the economic recovery in New South Wales, given the sort of impact on fuel, energy prices and the potential outcomes following that?
Well, I think there's no doubt it's going to certainly impact fuel. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. And what does that do? That impacts household budgets and businesses around the state. And that's why that, combined with where we'd see inflation over the next 12 to 18 months, interest rates as well set to rise, that the pressure on household budgets across the state are going to be a concern. And that's why we're going to continue to focus on those cost of living measures to help provide that support, that confidence. We do know, as I've said, that during the pandemic, we have seen savings rates increase. Balance sheets for many businesses across the state are also in a strong position across the board. So we come into this period with confidence and with strong foundations. But these types of events as well also have an impact on consumer confidence, on business confidence. So obviously we will watch it, but There's certainly a concern on prices, but confidence will be the key thing that we need to continue to encourage and instill that as we move through this challenging time.
Just notice there's a question from the audience.
Thank you. My name is Yoko. I'm from APA. So I think it was in October last year, Matt Keane announced the New South Wales hydrogen strategy. And in that, I think he talked about a $3 billion support program to transform New South Wales into a green hydrogen superpower. A year prior to that, there was the previous person asked the question around the trade offices. I think one of the trade offices that you increased footprint on was in Tokyo, where you appointed a new senior trade commissioner. I think your news report said that it was a trebling of footprint and staff presence. And so Japan, I guess, has sort of announced $400 billion worth of grants and incentives to make its pathway into the green growth strategy. What is your government sort of thinking about in terms of leveraging and strengthening the currently $100 billion plus trade and investment relationship that you have with Japan? Thank you.
A lot. It's top of mind, and I've already had a number of meetings with ambassadors and Consul General of Japan because it's a great question. Their connection with New South Wales is only going to grow given their focus on green hydrogen. And the first trip that I'll be making, obviously they've got their own restrictions in place now as Premier, will be to Japan to enhance that relationship and drive that investment that we've put on the table in terms of our $3 billion focus and strategy on green hydrogen and their interest in partnering with New South Wales on that. So as a result of the work and the interest that came from Japan just following that announcement, the first trade trip that I'll be making will be to Japan to enhance that relationship and drive investment into both New South Wales and obviously support them economically as well, because they see it as a strong focus in terms of economic growth for them and where they want to invest, as we do here in New South Wales. So that relationship is only going to grow. And as I said, and we've already had it. I think if I look at from my perspective, and Stuart will be having his own meetings in this space in terms of the trade discussions that I've had with overseas jurisdictions, I've had more with Japan, and in every one of those discussions, it's been entirely focused pretty much on green hydrogen and the opportunities for both for our state and their country.
Look, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up on the Q&A. There's nowhere near enough time, Premier. What I would like to say is thank you and congratulate you on the start to your premiership, but also acknowledge that the government you've been part of and is now leading has provided a level of governance and leadership over the last few years that's unmatched, and the state is in a much better position as a result. So I'd like to congratulate you on that. And now invite Jeff to give a vote of thanks. I'm going to.
Thanks, Megan. Megan said to me as I was walking up, "Jeff, you're on mute," which is the first opportunity that I can actually say. I think you probably meant please put it on mute. She's been on a call with me many times. Megan's a fellow board member of mine at CEDA. I'm Jeff Connolly. I'm the chair and the CEO of the Siemens organisation in Australia. I'd like to thank Anthony and, of course, the Premier for that session and for giving us, Premier, a first-hand account of the complexity of challenges being dealt with by the state. And I think more important than the challenges is a first-hand account of the highlights of where you want to steer the state in the future. It's a pleasure, privilege to sponsor the State of the State event and to conduct the vote of thanks. And it's part of Siemens' ongoing role for the economic development of this country. Siemens has been, and you might see some logo up there, is celebrating this year 150 years in Australia. So by no means are we a foreign multi that's fly in, fly out. We're part of the fabric of what goes on in Australia, and proudly so. Premier, it's really uplifting to hear that we're talking about things post-pandemic, as well as reflecting on what the pandemic was. We now understand the epidemiology responses, what constitutes meaningful data for our decision-making. We have the technologies in our hands now to ensure we have a balanced, proportionate response within an ethical framework for when those pandemics come in the future. So I think we're, as you said, in much better shape for the future to deal with those sorts of things. And of course, this type of event, and we talk about roadmap to recovery, this type of event where the Premier stands up and talks about what he's thinking about, those things actually, of course, helps to build trust and engagement in the community, which is a very important part of that roadmap to recovery post-pandemic. Premier, you mentioned the need for targeted research and development in modern manufacturing priorities. For those who know me, that's a very passionate sweet spot for me too. I think we need to be doing much more of that. I think as a technology company, we will see, of course, technologies emerging that will be critical to the heart of Australia's success, but also New South Wales' success. And as you rightly say, if you're going to have a resurgence, you need to get focused on skills and technologies. I quote often Alan Finkel when the topic of emissions comes up. He's the oracle. And he simply says, new technologies are a way to make old technologies redundant. As we electrify everything in the pursuit of net zero emissions, new technologies solve the legacy problems of previous technologies. And a technology-led pathway to that net zero is actually what we're facing, and I'm pleased to hear you say that you're investing in those renewable areas. Also, pleased to hear you talk about cities, 6 cities, extending that out. I think that's right. From our perspective, digitalisation in the context of infrastructure in cities is a key issue. Understanding data and doing something meaningful with it. If you talk about, from your speech, hospitals, transport networks, energy grids, water, schools, manufacturing, building precincts, they will need to be individually more resilient, but collectively interconnected, so that those sorts of threats that we know we will face, whether that is pandemic or from other sources, we're better placed to manage those. Some of the phrases that resonated with me, particularly today, of course, ready resurgence. I think that's absolutely spot on. I love when a leader stands up and talks about confidence, and too often on stages around Australia, we actually talk the economy down and we talk things down, and it's the role of leaders to talk things up and see the positive half glass full aspects of the society that we live in. Infrastructure pipeline, none of us would disagree with that, and the size of the stimulus there is mouthwatering. The question, of course, is how to roll that out in the face of, as you acknowledge, the labour shortages. This is the discussion around Australia, labour shortages and price rises in those supply chains, so we look forward to managing that topic. Comment you made, Australia is strongest when middle Australia is thriving. I think there wouldn't be anybody in the room who would disagree with that sentiment, and thank you for the comment. Outcomes of education being more job ready. Also another topic that's very, very close to my heart. Producing outcomes that actually enable people to get jobs is at the heart of what we need to be doing, particularly in labour shortages. And of course, you mentioned health technologies, which help to protect us all. I had the pleasure on the head table there to have Roche Chareau from Sydney Water, one of the co-sponsors of today. And I am really impressed by what they're doing there and enthusiastic about their digitalisation efforts. Predictive real-time responses on simulation of digital twin philosophies. So that sort of use in infrastructure of what technologies can do, I think, is going to set us up very nicely. Also on my table, I had Andrew Parfitt, who's the new Vice Chancellor at UTS. And from a Siemens perspective, we're going to continue our Industry 4.0 partnership with UTS as we try to imagine post-secondary learning using research test labs lined up to New South Wales industries of comparable advantage and potential, which I think is a critical rethink of how we see education outcomes. I'd like to congratulate the Premier and his team for articulating this optimistic vision for New South Wales. I think nobody in the room would doubt your passion Premier, and even you made light of some transport issues earlier in the week. Notwithstanding, that must have been less than preferable. I think everybody also appreciates the energy you're showing in this new role. Thank you for that. And in closing, CEDA as an organisation was established to harness the ideas and influence of the leading thinkers from business, government, community and academia. CEDA is a research-based, independent, non-partisan platform to exchange perspectives on those things that really matter for Australia's economic future. So I commend CEDA to anybody that's here. Keep supporting the CEDA organisation, because I think it really sets itself apart by its non-partisan approach to these discussions. Closing, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors. Of course, these types of events can't occur without sponsors. Westpac, Serco, Sydney Water and PwC, thank you very much for joining. And of course, judging by the calibre of the audience in the room today, it's fair to say that we all value what CEDA does. And I thank you all for taking interest in what's the future of this great state. Lastly, again, thank you, Premier, for your time, engagement, and I'd hand back to Megan, who is about to come off mute.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And look, Jeff likes to profess in that joking manner that some of his best material is delivered, in fact, while the mute button is on. But I can absolutely assure you, sitting on the board with the likes of Jeff and Pradeep, that is absolutely not true. It's an absolute honour to sit on the board of CEDA with you and to learn from you every single time I do. Look, for me, the key takeaways from today, and just to reflect, was really built around the theme of resilience. And you know, coming out of that, it's really about how do you build resilience in an economy, in a community. And I think that the Premier's comments really reflected on three key parts of that building program. The first is that you have to have consumer and community confidence. And you do that by planning, by knowing that things aren't always going to go to plan, by making sure that you're mitigating risk. It's something that's very dear to the heart of the Governance Institute and governance professionals, by looking at the different options and optionality that you have to address in order to be prepared. And that's, I think, what the New South Wales Government has done. It's been prepared economically to bear the brunt of the shock that we've seen, but it's also prepared in terms of the planning it's doing for the future resilience it needs. The second theme that really came out for me is that you have to have a building mindset. We know in business that you can't just sit and put out fires. You have to be thinking about where you're heading in the future, where the trends are going. And it's just so exciting to me to hear such a building mindset in New South Wales, whether that be through transport infrastructure, whether it be through the health system, whether it be through our human capital, both the labour shortages that we're seeing in the short term, but also developing the skills of tomorrow through our education and training systems. Those sorts of things are absolutely imperative. And it's not just, as the Premier said, about the hero projects. It's about the little things, because I know in transport, coming from that background, a lot of the little projects, the tier 2 and 3 projects, are actually those that deliver the most efficiency for the system. And so it's about building in those systems efficiencies, but also, as the Premier said, about building in social outcomes as well. And the third thing that really struck for me is the concept of not solving tomorrow's problems with yesterday's solutions. And we've come very much from an environment where, and we in the business world, of course, we know very much about competition. And competition's important. Competitive federalism is important. But so is collaboration. The complexity of the problems of the future are only going to be solved when different parties come together and work together. And it's so refreshing, I have to say, from my perspective, when we're dealing with some of the complex policy issues that CEDA looks at all the time, that we're doing so in an environment where we're open to working together, even be that across political divide, across state divide, geography divide. It's absolutely important. And I like to think of it as moving into a state of co-opetition rather than competition, which certainly necessarily hasn't served us well in the past. So look, thank you very much from my perspective, Premier. They're some of the things that I took away. But thank you all for joining us today. We have over 400 people in the room, and we've had over 200 people additionally online. So it's just been an amazing event. And I would say, Premier, it's wonderful to have hosted you for your first State of the State address. And we at CEDA look forward to working with you and your team going forward into the future. Thank you once again to our sponsors, Serco, Siemens, Westpac, PwC and Sydney Water. And CEDA also looks forward to engaging with you ongoing in the future. The results of today's poll question, which I know you've all been waiting with bated breath to see, I believe is on the screen in front of you. So I can't actually see the screen. Someone might be able to tell me what the answer to the problems are. I think the COVID solutions is still front of mind. Now, please don't forget to rate your experience in Pigeonhole before you depart, and keep an eye out for the post-event email, which will include a link to today's live stream recording so that you can rewatch and share with colleagues. Finally, don't miss other opportunities to join colleagues and key contacts for conversations such as today. You can register now for the following programs in Sydney. Next Thursday, 3rd of March, we will welcome the ACCC Chair Rod Sims for his annual Enforcement and Compliance Policy Update. Fascinating watching and viewing if you can. And this will, of course, be Rod's last update as Chair, so please join the audience if you can. On Monday, the 21st of March, CEDA will host a full-day conference on Is Australia's Big Infrastructure Bill Delivering Value? The full-day conference has a fantastic array of speakers, and the Federal Minister, including the Federal Minister and Shadow Minister responsible for infrastructure, Minister Paul Fletcher, and Shadow Minister Catherine King, and Infrastructure Australia CEO and a dear friend of mine, Romilly Madu, and her counterparts from the state infrastructure advisory organisations, an array of corporate stakeholders. The forum will explore how we can maximise the value of our infrastructure for future generation. And you talked about, once again, collaborative contracting and procurement, which are really key. And we've seen that over just the last few days with the disastrous pro-build circumstances. So I encourage you, please visit CEDA's website and review and register for these events. But most importantly, in the interest of productivity and efficiency, I bid you farewell and let you get back to your workplaces. But of course, continue to network, seeing as that we have the fantastic opportunity to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you.